of those who were against Brexit. See, for instance, the Poles flocking in, because Britain was the first country to let the Poles in after the admission of Poland. Now we've got 700,000 Poles in Britain, and a major reason for people to vote for Brexit. At the same time, Britain, was the most integration-adverse country within the Union. No deepening, no federalization, and even no common defense on the part of the European Union. Another contradictory element. Brexit made exit a much touted option for other countries, at least for certain right-wing people within other countries. But at the same time, Brexit made those member countries more flexible, like Germany, for instance, who were most strict when it came to following the rules, in particular with respect to finances and monetary policy. And after all, with Brexit, the European Union lost a major donor country and a huge market, and hence led to a serious economic weakening of the European Union. Then we have migration. Migration was clearly an example of no solidarity among the European member states, but going it alone. Clearly, unilateralism in this policy area prevails. Look at Dublin 1 to 3. Which was a pipe dream in many respects and transferred management of migration to the border countries, notably Greece, Italy, and Spain. On the other hand, COVID, or Corona, was a clear example of solidarity at work. That applies to the vaccine policy, which was not left to the individual member states, although that was, at least by some of them, originally intended. And moreover, the COVID recovery package, the so-called Recovery and Resilience Facility, adopted by the Council in February this year, bringing 672 billion euros of support to member states to help address the consequences of COVID. So a clear example of solidarity. And then we do have the euro still, which somehow combines the misalliance, if you wish, between a common monetary policy on the one hand and a still national fiscal policy on the other. By the way, there is a similarity with COVID management, because at least from the second wave onwards, borders were kept open, whereas member states pursued national policies on the epidemic, which created, as we know, quite a few problems. And more generally, how to position the European Union in the perceived global great power conflict, which apparently is emerging. And what is the future of the EU development model in light of all these most recent developments with respect to the normative foundation of the European Union, civil rights, democracy, rule of law, and with respect to the social model, both having become salient with the temporary question mark rise of populism. So these are truly structural challenges, insofar at least as they have a serious impact on the procedures, reach, intrusiveness of EU policies, and on the internal balance of forces within the European Union. And they are by no means just vagaries of individuals, not even individual member states. In other words, they change the characteristic pattern of relationships within the EU, and that, after all, defines the structure. We're going to have altogether 5 major contributions, which not exactly address the structures, but at least policy with structural impacts. And I would suggest that we follow the sequence of the program, meaning starting with Tatiana Romanova, who will address the EU's Green Deal and resilience of the European Union's energy policy and EU-Russia relations. According to the program, Tatiana, you've got just 10 minutes to give your presentation. I hope you can meet that time restriction. Tatiana, please go ahead. We are already late.
Give me a second to upload my presentation.
Give you what?
I'm applauding my presentation.
I applaud it. Please go ahead. The PowerPoint is gone again.
I know it
was right here.
No, it was not mine. It was somebody else.
I didn't look at it. I just saw a PowerPoint.
Yeah. It's gone. Just.
And?
Is it coming? Yeah, it is.
Not here.
It's nearly there.
It's too far away.
It's on the way.
Now it's, here we are.
Yeah. So it just may take a while in this program. But anyways, yeah, so I'm starting. Basically, when I initially submitted the paper, I was more interested in the resilience, yeah? And now my interest evolved to the Green Deal more than resilience. But anyways, the presentation basically links the two, and I will start with resilience and then proceed with the Green Deal, which is indeed a structural factor in the transformation of the European Union and a very important factor in the evolution of EU-Russian relations as well. Yeah? But I start with the resilience. Resilience, it's a word which is now nearly omnipresent for better or worse. But if you look at the theory of resilience, there are 4 features that are to be mentioned. Yeah? One is that resilience is a systemic feature. Yeah? So anyways, it's any system is characterized by it. Yeah? And it's a feature which basically enables the system to survive. Yeah? It's immanent. Yeah? If there's no resilience, then the system just collapses. Yeah? Then resilience is always about resources and challenges. Yeah? But in a way, when we speak about resilience, we emphasize resources rather than challenges. You know? And that's, in a way, a difference between resilience and securitization, because when we securitize something, we speak about challenges, you know, whereas in resilience, we basically talk about what resources can be applied to keep the system alive and to maintain it. Thirdly, ethical connotations are not that relevant in resilience because, ethical connotations characterize the system, but not resilience as such. Yeah? It's a system that can be bad or good, yeah? Democratic or totalitarian, but resilience can characterize any system, be it democratic system or authoritarian system. Yeah? And then we also have to keep in mind that there are systems at different levels. Yeah? And therefore, we can speak at the resilience of different systems. And sometimes when we maintain the resilience of one system, we can actually undermine the resilience of other systems. Yeah? And this is exactly the issue that interests me in the case of EU-Russian energy relations and the Green Deal and energy transition. Yeah? Because the trick is whether as a result of the Green Deal, we will manage to, not the trick, but the question, yeah, the key question is whether as a result of the Green Deal, we will be able to maintain the resilience of the EU system and the system of EU-Russian energy relations, or whether the EU, by improving its resilience through the Green Deal and energy transition, will in fact undermine the resilience of the EU-Russian energy relations and of the EU-Russian system of relations. Because if there is anything that still keeps this system, the system of EU-Russian relations alive, it's to a large extent energy relations, and energy trade, which have been sustained, have been rearranged, but maintain this system to a large extent. So what do we see in the Green Deal? Yeah? And very quickly, there is the EU's reasoning and there is the Russian reasoning. Yeah? And the EU, of course, is much more advanced in this particular field. The EU has been been contemplating green transition for quite a while. Now we know that it came with the 2019 Commission communication, but there were important preconditions leading to that. You know? And of course, if you look about the sequence, sort of like, or the hierarchy of priorities, if you want, you know, then there are environmental rhetoric. They use environmental rhetoric, yeah, and in that particular case, speaking about EU-Russian energy relations, we must say that the role of natural gas and nuclear energy continue to be unclear. Yeah? And we know that the EU's taxonomy, in fact, didn't answer the question of whether energy transition will be based, at least at least in the short term and medium term, on nuclear energy and natural gas or not. You know? Then, of course, there are important economic concerns, like the sort of like new strategy of job creation, development of small and medium enterprises, financing the new generation EU facility, global competitiveness. Yeah? So there's a whole economic block. You know? And then speaking about the relations with Russia, there's also a very important energy security rhetoric. Yeah? So the concerns about energy security and the aspiration that Green Deal will sort of like help to ease the EU's energy dependence on Russia. You know? So in that sense, it's yeah. So like this rhetoric sort of like, well, in a way, challenges the system of EU-Russian relations as it is now. You know? Russia's reasoning is more eclectic, and it's still emerging. It's only emerging, you know? And we can see from the intensity of the debates in Russia how it just like came from sort of like from being nothing to sort of like being an extremely salient issue. In different parts, like of experts community, including in the international community. Yeah? And Russia, in fact, builds sort of like its strategy in this field on economic concerns. Yeah? So economic concerns are by far the dominant, yeah? With the role of natural gas and nuclear energy being emphasized, yeah, as the cheapest sort of like ways of energy transition and sort of like the Green Deal. Yeah? And with, for example, with the challenge that Russia sort of like poses to the border adjustment mechanism that the European Union contemplates. Yeah? And in fact, there are calculations that Russia will probably, if the European Union introduces this cross-border adjustment mechanism, Russia will suffer the most from it. Yeah? And then sort of like environmental concerns, in fact, like follow, yeah, and they are clearly sort of like still secondary in the Russian sort of like discussion on green energy. And we can see that sort of like Russia engages only to a small extent with the arguments of the European Union. You know? So in that sense, we can argue that yes, Russia tries to sort of like maintain the resilience of the EU-Russian energy system, but on the existing basis, yeah, on the basis of the past rather than on the basis of sort of like the future. You know? Then there are, of course, other important reasons that influence both systems. You know? Well, at the level of bilateral relations, yeah, there are two plausible lines, yeah, that can be sort of that can be taken. Yeah. One is that the Green Deal is a way for Russia and the European Union to engage in a depoliticized sort of like cooperation, to selectively engage, if you want to use the terminology of the 5 principles of the European Union. You know? And that's sort of like a way to engage in a mutual sort of a beneficial way. Or the other way, another approach, which is not excluded, is that the Green Deal can follow the dynamics of EU-Russian relations, which, as we know, is far from being the best. You know? And that sort of is exemplified by all sorts of talks on institutions being destroyed and on sanctions that might affect the Green Deal. You know? And then at the sort of like systemic level, we also sort of like see different approaches, you know, with the European Union sort of linking the Green Deal with its normative power, Europe with its normative power, and sort of like looking at the normative power as an instrument to sort of like advance that agenda. Yeah? And Russia, on the other hand, sort of like looking at the Green Deal, at energy transition, at environmental debates, as sort of like a venue where it can probably challenge, or it should probably challenge, Western normative domination by sort of like suggesting some alternatives that will be in tune with the priorities of non-Western countries. And that, of course, is geared to confrontation. That, of course, is sort of like geared to sort of like challenging the system of EU-Russian energy relations as it exists now. So basically, that brings me back to the initial slide, the slide I started with. That sort of like we see sort of like the two systems, sort of like looking for their resilience, looking for how to rearrange resources, like to address the challenge of the Green Deal. But it looks at present that the resilience of the EU system will be sort of like improved to a large extent at the expense of the resilience of the EU-Russian system of energy relations, which of course also poses serious questions to Russia, to the Russian economy, and to sort of like its further development. I will stop here. I hope I respected my time, and I will be happy to answer any further question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tatiana. It's quite nice that you ended with questions, so we have a good starting point for the discussion. I suppose that the discussion will only follow after all these 4 or 5 presentations. Is that correct from the part of the organizers? Yes, yes. Well, let's assume we proceed according to the program. Okay, thank you. We have a second presentation by Fabienne Bossuch. A New Europe after COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic as an EU opportunity to prioritize people-focused recovery. Fabienne is an assistant professor at the Center for EU Studies. Where is that?
That's in Ghent in Belgium.
Belgium, so somebody from the European Union. Quite nice. Hello.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here as one of the few from an EU country. Okay, so
go ahead.
We will stay with the topic of resilience, but we will shift the focus to societal resilience. So basically, my paper starts from the observation that the COVID-19 pandemic has tested societal resilience in Europe and across the world to its fullest. And so the pandemic revealed the pressing need to increase investments in socio-economic infrastructure and policies, in particular, of course, in the field of healthcare and social safety. And across the EU, those who have been hit the hardest by the COVID-19 crisis are the most vulnerable people in society, including the elderly and households with low incomes. Now, given that, unfortunately, similar crises are likely to emerge in the future, the societal resilience that is needed to cope with the shocks that such crisis creates will need to be significantly enhanced if Europe wants to continue to thrive in an increasingly volatile and unpredictable world. Now, I argue that this can be done by putting more emphasis on so-called people-focused recovery, and in doing so, laying the ground for stronger societal resilience. And central to this approach is a focus on well-being and a focus on inclusiveness, rather than simply prioritizing economic growth and job creation. So more and more voices are basically already claiming that if we return to business as usual, this would not translate into a sustainable long-term recovery that would also enhance well-being and that would reduce inequality. So instead, what the EU needs is it needs to seize the COVID-19 recovery as an opportunity to push forward an innovative, people-focused agenda, which goes beyond economic growth and job creation by prioritizing other aspects that can contribute to inclusion and well-being, such as access to education, job quality, housing, and access to healthcare. Now, crises like the COVID-19 pandemic are inevitable. They are bound to repeat themselves. Therefore, societies must learn to bounce back as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so the concept of resilience, and specifically societal resilience, is well placed to capture this, as it focuses on the extent to which a state, but in this case a society, can mitigate or adapt to a crisis. Now, as I'm a scholar specializing in EU foreign policy and EU external relations, I argue that the EU, as a self-proclaimed force for good in the world, should also seize the post-COVID-19 recovery period as an opportunity to promote the people-focused recovery through its external relations. So by putting a focus on inclusion and well-being more centrally in its approach to foreign aid, the EU should support the ability of local societal actors to self-organize and to draw on their local strength and knowledge of available resources in mitigating and adapting to the COVID-19 crisis, but also to any future crisis. In my paper, I use the case of Central Asia as an example to illustrate how the EU could seize the COVID-19 recovery exactly as an opportunity to promote this people-focused recovery in third countries, namely by supporting the ability of the local societal actors to self-organize and to draw on their local strength and knowledge of the available resources. Now, Central Asia stands out as a case where such a people-focused approach could bear fruit, as the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the crucial role that civil society and also community-based initiatives in the Central Asian countries have played in offering life-saving assistance, specifically in areas where the governments fell short. Much more than Western societies, the societies in Central Asia are collective in nature rather than individualistic. And this also implies that solidarity among the members of the communities is much more embedded in local practices and customs than in Western societies. Moreover, in countries like the Central Asian countries, state capacity remains relatively weak, and vital public services like healthcare and social protection are deficient. And so in such contexts, societal resilience is even more important in order to stand up to a major crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in such contexts, state resilience is basically too low to be able to cope with the implications of a crisis of such magnitude. And so resilience strategies that involve the sharing of responsibilities among individuals, but also among communities, will increase the ability of these countries to stand up to such crisis in the future. The COVID-19 crisis has really put this assertion to the test. And in the case of Central Asia, the crisis has revealed that civil society has been truly instrumental in addressing the direct implications of the pandemic. Now, with the term civil society, I'm referring here both to the formally organized civil society, but also to informal civil society at the level of communities. Now, returning to the concept of resilience, Tatiana already nicely referred to it, and so this was launched when we look at the EU, and since the launch of the global strategy in 2019, the EU now conceptualizes resilience as the ability of states and societies to reform, thus withstanding and recovering from internal and external crisis. Now, I want to be a bit critical in this regard, although this may seem as a promising feature, and that the EU acknowledges that strengthening resilience in third countries involves granting the local societies more ownership, given that positive change can only be homegrown. But in my understanding, the EU really still falls short of truly empowering local societies and strengthening governance at a societal level from the bottom up, simply because it still has this very Eurocentric fixation on EU norms sharing through already ready-made solutions. So I think if the EU truly wants to be seen as boosting resilience at a societal level, then it really has to shift its focus more to a people-focused approach. So basically what this implies is that the EU would have to accept these local societies for what they are, and the EU should advocate homegrown self-organization and homegrown self-governance. And this might involve having to account for local systems and local mechanisms of governance that could be radically different from European practices of governance. So let me end my talk by turning to the question how this could play out in the EU's promotion of societal resilience in Central Asia. So to do so, let us consider the key role that civil society in these countries has played in standing up to the COVID-19 crisis. For example, in Tajikistan, civil society worked together with the government and international organizations in addressing several of the challenges caused by the crisis, including on food security, but also education. In the field of education, for example, distance learning was made possible by initiatives developed by associations of parents and teachers. Civil society also played a crucial role in helping out people in remote villages during the pandemic. In Kazakhstan, for instance, civil society played also a crucial role. For instance, volunteer-based organizations, often with a wide network throughout the country, they proved to be very flexible and they really managed to help vulnerable communities. Also in Uzbekistan, self-organized activists, but also self-organized volunteers have played a crucial role in the delivery of aid, including food provision, also medical services, especially in the case of vulnerable groups, including the elderly and disabled people. But also, for instance, in Uzbekistan, the mahalas stepped in to offer support to community members who were in need. Another example is the online charity groups that were created to offer diverse services and support to victims of the pandemic. Interestingly, more generally, social media revealed to have a strong mobilization potential during the pandemic, and this across the whole region of Central Asia. In Telegram, for instance, doctors created groups to offer advice to people who were not able to receive medical help from hospitals. Now, in sum, given that several of the Central Asian countries have a strong tradition of homegrown solidarity movements and locally embedded forms of self-governance, my argument is that the EU should really seize the post-COVID-19 recovery as an opportunity to help boost societal resilience in Central Asia, exactly by supporting the ability of the local societal actors to self-organize and to draw on their local strengths and their local knowledge of the available resources. I will end my talk here, but I should also emphasize that this is still very much work in progress. So if I anticipate any questions, I hope I will be able to provide a response, but do please bear with me because this is still very much work in process. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fabienne. Oh, no, I hear me twice again. Well, that's not a problem. I mean, as long as we are progressing, we are on the right track, I suppose. It was quite interesting. Well, politically wise, I feel tempted to argue that the experience we have been made or are still making with regard to fighting the pandemic all over the world, not just in Central Asia, is that the society, luckily enough, stepped in when states failed. The question is whether we can build upon a policy on that once the state fights back. That's a political issue. There's also a scholarly issue, which one could erase, but that's up to the discussion. Now we move on to Natalia Kondratyeva. That will be in Russian, if I'm not wrong. It's about value and price of digital transformation of the EU single market. Natalia.
Professor Spanger, and Natalia will present her paper in English, so can we help you with our simultaneous translation?
Whom? If the paper is in English?
No,
the presentation?
Natalia's paper will be in Russian.
Yes.
So can we help you to make you able to listen to the simultaneous translation?
I don't know whether you can help me. I hear it in Russian now.
Пожалуйста, включите мою презентацию, если это возможно.
Наталья Борисовна, вы понимаете русский, да? Вы сможете прослушать на русском, профессор Шпангер. Потому что we can help you with our translation.
I'm not sure whether you can help me, but it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Александр, объясните, пожалуйста.
Yeah, first of all, should follow the link. This is the translation that you obtained, I suppose.
So.
Have you?
I hear everything. sometimes twice.
Have you turned the link with translation?
Yes, I hear you, but there is no translation yet because she hasn't started yet. Natalia.
Я бы попросила включить мою презентацию.
Да.
Загружаю.
Да, спасибо. Я должна выключить, наверное, я поняла, я должна выключить переводчик.
Отлично.
Сейчас все в порядке, я могу начать. Уважаемые коллеги, цель моего доклада – осмыслить логику регулирования единого внутреннего рынка и в том числе логику его цифрового преобразования. Под логикой я понимаю формирование правильного представления о трансформациях с использованием научной теории. И я бы хотела все-таки что-то теоретическое высказать и встать на какие-то позиции, может быть, предложить свои позиции. Мы говорили о коронакризисе, который усиливает неопределенность в экономическом развитии Европейского Союза. И, конечно, он усложнит реализацию принятых недавно, в апреле, национальных планов восстановления. Я подразумеваю задачи, которые поставлены в цифровой стратегии Европейской комиссии. И эта стратегия предусматривает поощрение роста цифровых технологий и регулирование цифровизации во всех, без исключения, сферах экономики и общества. С одной стороны, есть задача цифровизации благодаря наличию достижений технического прогресса и возможность повысить конкурентоспособность. Но с другой стороны, есть очень высокая цена, есть расходы на эти технологии и есть риски для экономически активного населения. Решение кроется в правильной интерпретации вот этого противоречивого состояния. И мне кажется, здесь важно напомнить о двух очень старых, но хороших экономических теориях XX века. Второй слайд, пожалуйста. О таком перманентном противоречии рыночной цивилизации. Пожалуйста, второй слайд. Сказали два уважаемых ученых. Это Карл Поланьи и Рональд Коуза. Будьте любезны, второй слайд. Будьте любезны, второй слайд.
Я прошу прощения, у меня слайды переключаются. Вы их видите? Второй слайд вы видите сейчас, да?
Я вообще не вижу слайдов. Лично я вообще не вижу слайдов.
Я тоже
Так,
не вижу.
хорошо. Запускаю еще раз. А сейчас?
Нет. О!
Наталья Борисовна, тот слайд?
Все в порядке.
Отлично. Я тогда оставлю в таком режиме презентацию, чтобы все было нормально.
Коллеги, я хотела бы повторить, на одной чаше весов развитие и закон спроса и предложения новых технологий, потребность развития. А на другой чаше весов это судьба акторов рынка. Все сознательно включаются в эту систему, потому что хотят получить прибыль. Но, как известно из теории, часть акторов получает эту прибыль. В данном случае такая популярная интерпретация существует, что есть десяток гигантов платформенного бизнеса, монополистов, начиная от Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook и так далее. А все остальные являются средством получения этой прибыли. Но цивилизационный аспект, о котором говорит Рональд Коуза, заключается в том, что регуляторы, это государства или интеграционные институты, они осознают это противоречие и пытаются дать ответ в виде политико-правовых актов. Коуза, он говорит о необходимости транзакционных издержек. Можно третий слайд? В третьем слайде я вспоминаю о системе, созданной Адамом Смитом. И вот Карл Поланьи, он говорил, что система рыночной экономики, она перестанет быть саморегулирующей. Вот есть 4 элемента: конкуренция, свобода предпринимательства, частная собственность и саморегулирование основных факторов производства и результатов производства. Поланьи говорит, не будет саморегулирования, не будет 4-го элемента, и система будет менее эффективна. А вопрос состоит в том, чем заменить этот элемент. Очень хорошее предложение содержится в модели единого внутреннего рынка ЕС. Заменить на свободу передвижения или на контроль передвижений факторов и результатов экономической деятельности. Таким образом, по предложению Нобелевского лауреата Рональда Коуза, регуляторы пытаются оправдать транзакционные издержки, и они включают в экономический анализ вот эту модель эффективности своей экономики, в которой уже есть элемент регулирования. Цифровизация – это элемент, который должен усилить конструкцию рыночной экономики. Он ускорит передвижение, и в этом состоит ценность цифровизации. Отсюда оправдана стратегия цифровизации. Но есть проблема. Проблема состоит в том, что цифровизация не оправдывает ожидания. Пожалуйста, 4-й слайд. Если цифровизация должна привести к снижению издержек на физический труд или на связь, то она повышает издержки на оплату квалифицированных кадров, на покупку технологий, на внедрение политико-правовых актов. И еще в 80-е годы еще один нобелевский лауреат, американец Роберт Солу, об этом сказал. Есть его известный парадокс: компьютеры проникли повсюду, кроме критерия эффективности или производительности. Высока ценность и высока цена цифровой трансформации, и нужно убедительное обоснование. Сегодня Татьяна Романова говорила о цене зеленой трансформации. Здесь то же самое. Есть высокая ценность, но есть высокая цена этих трансформаций. Пожалуйста, слайд 5. Я хочу заметить, что в западной модели существуют попытки объяснить и оправдать необходимость регулирования, несмотря на то, что мы прекрасно знаем, что Европейский Союз все-таки приверженец либеральной модели. Но, тем не менее, попытки оправдать регулирование и затраты существуют. Я привожу пример британского экономиста. Тим Джексон, он написал, что капитализм, который склонен к эффективности, он не позволит стабилизировать климат, он не позволит защитить планету от дефицита ресурсов. Я добавляю к этому, что необходимо вмешательство организаций наднациональных институтов. Да? То есть стремление к эффективности может наносить ущерб обществу. И, наконец, еще один знаменитый ученый, Джозеф Стиглиц, тоже нобелевский лауреат, он говорит только новый общественный договор, который гарантирует здравоохранение, образование, пенсии, жилье, работу за достойную оплату, может спасти либеральную демократию. Что я хочу сказать? Я хочу сказать, что хотя нет на Западе теории, которая оправдывает регулирование, есть такая попытка. И вот эта попытка, этот акцент необходимости оправдывания этих расходов, он вдохновляет сегодня Европейскую комиссию. И она находит оправдание, необходимость общественного благополучия. Об этом сегодня, наверное, попытался нам сказать наш коллега из Европейского Союза. В европейской экономике очень высокий уровень затрат на регулирование, на выполнение стандартов охраны окружающей среды, на цифровизацию и так далее. И вот важно обратить внимание на то, что эти затраты постоянно растут. Есть феномен общего бюджета ЕС. Вместе с господином Юнкером, бывшим председателем Европейской комиссии, появились внебюджетные инвестиционные инструменты, а на сегодняшний день мы видим огромный план финансирования восстановления ЕС и укрепления устойчивости, который трудно себе представить в размере триллиона. То есть постоянное увеличение расходов, об этом я говорю. Что может оправдать такие расходы? Могут оправдать, наверное, этические задачи, задачи повышения безопасности. Если можно следующий слайд. Известный мозговой центр, Центр европейских политических исследований пишет такое свое оправдание. Вот я привожу пример: 2 книги, 2 отчета, там очень много сказано в защиту регулирования. И я в одной из книг увидела слово «заповеди». То есть то, что принимается на веру. Вот в книге о цифровизации сельского хозяйства я увидела декалог аграрной цифровизации или 10 заповедей аграрной цифровизации. И мне это очень понравилось. Вот это как раз и есть то самое объяснение регулирования. То есть Европейский Союз принимает на веру, что его трансформации приведут к результату. Я заканчиваю свое выступление лишь одним вопросом. Есть ли все же общественный консенсус в необходимости таких огромных расходов? Мне кажется, что впереди дискуссия о будущем Европы, и она раскроет много нового и, видимо, даст ответ на этот вопрос. Основная моя мысль, которую я бы хотела донести, что приоритеты цифровизации, можно последний слайд? Приоритеты цифровизации, которые достаточно понятны, это адекватная связь, это базовые навыки и многое-многое другое. Все эти приоритеты, они очень затратные, но в них есть вера. И им, видимо, отсутствует альтернатива, и, несмотря на высокую цену, им Европейский Союз будет следовать. То есть объяснение в том, что это стратегия, которая на сегодняшний день принимается на веру, и, видимо, эта вера в Европейском Союзе присутствует. Спасибо.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalia. I think in many respects that presentation nicely linked up to the previous one as being a quite intriguing piece of advocacy You referred to Schumpeter at the very end of your presentation. I would refer to Schumpeter in a different sense, in the sense of destructive, creative destruction, as the, if you wish, market way out of the dilemma you lined out by confronting the social costs and the market principles. Just a quick remark. I leave it at that. The next speaker is Kirill Entin, and here he is. Very good. He will give a presentation on the role of the European Union Court of Justice in ensuring the rule of law and independence of the judiciary. I tend to put a question mark behind that, but you'll give the answer, I guess.
Absolutely.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm basically joining you from Minsk, where I'm located at the court of the Eurasian Economic Union right now. But in my presentation, I won't be talking about our court in Minsk. I'll be talking about Luxembourg, because I think that it is quite a big change that is happening currently in the European Union. It is this new role of the Court of Justice of the European Union in protecting the rule of law and fundamental values. Because basically we know that values have always played a very important part for the European Union. If we open the founding treaties of the European Union, immediately in Article 2, you will see that the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. The same can be said regarding accession to the European Union, since the elaboration of the Copenhagen criteria. Basically, the process has not significantly changed. In Article 49 of the Treaty on the European Union, it is written that only European states which respect the values referred to in Article 2 and are committed to promoting them may apply. However, once a state is in, there was no effective mechanism for controlling the respect of these values, notably for controlling the respect of the rule of law. While for, let's say, for the human rights component, there were numerous mechanisms, and the Court of Justice of the European Union started applying human rights in connection with EU law quite early on, and all the EU member states have always been also members of the Council of Europe. The same could not be said about respect of the other values, and notably rule of law. And of course, over the last dozen years, we sadly witnessed several member states, naming basically Poland and Hungary, basically on this very dangerous road, on this very dangerous transformation, not only on towards politically authoritarian regimes, but also we witnessed that these regimes undertook numerous steps to subvert, to eliminate the independence of the judicial system, to undermine the pluralism of information, and even attack academic freedom. Like with the scandal of the Central European University in Budapest. And we also witnessed the fact that political mechanism that appeared after the Treaty of Nice, the famous Article 7, that was thought to be this Damocles sword hanging over the heads of the member states and reminding them of the obligation to behave was basically useless, and became completely and utterly useless with this alliance of Poland and Hungary, because in order to apply Article 7, in order to apply sanctions pursuant to Article 7, basically unanimity is required, which is impossible under the current circumstances. Of course, we could talk about this new budgetary mechanism that has been introduced by the member states, and became basically binding, but so far the Commission has been reluctant to use this budgetary mechanism to apply budgetary cuts against member states. And also there was a political agreement pursuant to which Poland and Hungary would be first given the opportunity to go to the Court of Justice to make their case against the validity of such mechanism, tying budgetary funds to the respect of rule of law. So in the absence of basically effective mechanism that could be used, we witnessed a very curious transformation. We witnessed how the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, who itself could not be basically said to be at all time a model, a champion of the promotion of rule of law, suddenly stepped up its game and suddenly undertook this new role. And we witnessed several important judgments. I could be talking about the judgment regarding Hungary preserving academic freedom. I could be talking about another judgment against Hungary, basically pronouncing the Hungarian legislation mirroring the Russian law on foreign agents to be incompatible with the provisions of the founding treaties, incompatible with EU law. Instead, I would say that I would like to address, as an example, two judgments regarding Poland, because while the Hungarian judgments, I'd say, will contribute towards the reinforcement and the preservation of the rule of law, they don't deal specifically with this matter. The Court of Justice is using basically market mechanism, is using the provisions of WTO GATS and the provisions on the law, on the EU law on the free movement of capital in order to declare the Hungarian legislation incompatible. However, with regard to Poland, we witnessed several judgments addressing the independence of the judiciary system, which is, of course, a key component of the rule of law. And this is why I think that these judgments and these provisions are so important. And notably, the judgment in the Commission versus Poland case, C-619-18, which was delivered on in June 2019. In this judgment, why is it so important? Because the court directly addresses the issue of the independence of the judiciary, and while it does clarify that the independence of the judiciary has two essential components: the external component and the internal component, and both of them are basically strengthened by the principle of irremovability of judges. The court does clarify that while this principle is not wholly absolute and exceptions could be allowed, but these exceptions should at all time be based on legitimate and compelling grounds and subject to the principle of proportionality. The test basically used by the European Court of Justice is very curious one, because the European Court of Justice writes that any restrictions should not raise reasonable doubt in the minds of individuals as to the imperviousness of the court concerned to external factors and its neutrality with respect to the interests before it. So basically, the minds of the individuals and the impression that a certain reform produces on individuals, on, let's say, independent observer, becomes basically the basic test in order to judge whether this principle has not been undermined. What happened exactly in the case was that simultaneously two laws were promoted in Poland regarding the Supreme Court. According to the first law, basically the retirement age of the judges of the Supreme Court has been lowered. And this reform should have affected not only future judges, but also judges already appointed on the bench. A second reform that was introduced in Poland was basically to make exception to this general rule, to this general retirement age, by allowing the president or the Polish president basically to extend the powers of a certain judge for a new 6 years terms, and basically could use this power even twice.
Kirill, time in Belarus is nearly up.
I'm nearly at the end, and that was basically, we witnessed how even the mere introduction of this action by the European Commission has forced Poland to withdraw this reform, has forced basically Poland to reinstate the judges that has been previously fired. And we see, and nonetheless, the Court of Justice saw that it needed to deliver these judges. It needed to make the case clear for all future legislations. And thus we see how basically through judicial mechanism, the European Court of Justice is able to protect the principles of irremovability of judges, to protect judicial independence, to protect rule of law in the EU. And the court basically, while being a legal institution, becomes also a very significant political actor in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kirill. Let's hope you are right. I'm afraid you are not, but doesn't matter. The next speaker, and that's the final one, is Julia Belous on the impact of the EU regional policy on centrifugal tendency in the political system of Spain.
Yes.
Julia,
Thank
please.
you, Professor Spanger. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to me to participate in this session. And today I would like to present my research paper that's called The Impact of the EU Regional Policy of Centrifugal Tendencies in the Political System of Spain. Actually, why it is interesting in my point of view? Actually, the modern multi-level system of governance in the European Union, especially three-tiered system of governance between the national, supranational, subnational levels, can be viewed as a relatively new, stable structural factor that is difficult or even impossible to change. It's my view. The factors that influence the dynamic of centrifugal tendencies in Spain has received a great deal of attention due to the growing interest in the issue in connection with the recent outbreaks of separatism in the country. The Spanish case actually is not the only one in the European Union. The problem of the central regions relations is relevant for almost all its members. The peculiarity of Spain in that it's a state of Western Europe that has carried out a democratic transition after the rule of Francisco Franco peacefully in a relatively short period of time. Next slide, please. We define the notion of centrifugal tendencies as a course of development that leads to a gradual depletion of the powers of the political center in the interest of regional politicians, but does not allow their recognition as an actor separate from the state. Next slide, please. Here you can see this notion, and next one. Thank you very much. In recent discussion, the EU regional policy has been viewed as a factor influencing Spanish centrifugal tendencies and contributing to centrifugal rather than to centripetal forces. The regional programs of the European Union are one of the many drivers pushing away from the center. These factors has played a role in virtually all central regional conflicts, as I've said. The less developed and more developed parts of country, each feeling exploited by others. It does not specifically aim at elevating grievances within member states, but it can be used as a tool by central governments to counter secessionist moves. However, it's not the only one. Ethnic, linguistic, religious, and/or cultural differences play a role as much as historical memories, such as past independence. These are indirect effects that require careful study to identify causal effects, because there can be so many reasons for the ebb and flow of such moves. Actually, Spain has often been the subject of analysis on the topic of empowering subnational actors. For example, researchers Jan Bach and Rachel Jones have identified three main reasons illustrating these changes in powers of subnational structures, and you can see it on the screen. Firstly, the institutional structure at the EU level forms the framework for the implementation of decisions. For instance, it's a partnership principle from 1988. Secondly, regions can take advantage of supranational structures to varying degree. Actually, regions with a higher level of autonomy have great opportunities to promote their interests at supranational level. Thirdly, the empowerment of the region by involving it in the program of the European Union's regional policy depends on the territorial structure, they say, of the state. That is, on the legally enshrined relations between the center and the periphery. Based on this, it's become obvious that institutionally all regions have an additional center of attraction. It's Brussels. Next slide, please. In addition to the institutional consequences of Spain's accession to the European Economic Community in 1986, Russian scholars note that EU policy leads to widening the gap in socio-economic well-being between the developed and developing regions of its member states. However, other Russian researchers, and today we have such a researcher, for instance, Natalia Kondratьева, posits in recent research that the EU does not set the task of fully aligning the welfare levels of individual countries and territories. Firstly, it does not have sufficient funds for this. Secondly, unevenness is inherent in a market economy and can be a factor of growth. And finally, the European Union does not carry out large-scale budgetary reallocations such as in the federal states. Next slide, please. Also, we see that in the framework of the European Union, the regions actually have an additional opportunity to internalize the internal conflict between the center and the regions. For example, the Committee of Regions became one of the mechanisms to protect interests of its regions. It's interesting that regional politicians can potentially influence the decision-making process at the first stage at the negotiation with a European Commission. In recent research, we also see that actually if the region receives quite a lot of funds from structural funds within the framework of regional programs of the European Union and are more dependent on this kind of funding, then the subnational parties of the EU member states are more supportive of European integration. We also see it in the fresh research. Next slide, please. So many studies have explained the growth of centrifugal tendencies in Spain. Slightly less developed in the world science is the analysis of the influence of the European Union on these dynamics. However, there are no studies that have tested these theories using qualitative comparative analysis. Next slide, please. There are many factors to consider when studying centrifugal tendencies. These conditions can be mutually influencing, speaking in QCA language. At the same time, these explanatory variables can be competing, but can equally influence the dynamics of centrifugal tendencies in Spain. So it's not only the regional policy of the EU. And in this slide, you can see several factors that we defined in order to make a QCA. So next slide, please. To operationalize the impact of EU regional policy on centrifugal tendencies in Spain, we decide to take the volume of total EU financial funds from the main European structural and investment funds to each separate regions according to 2014-2020 budget plan. Next slide, please. We also use the Regional Authority Index. It's a famous project that actually measures the amount of power of resources of regional governments, in particular their ability not only to make decisions for themselves, but also to participate in decisions regarding their status. In this sense, it's important to highlight the self-rule and shared rule dimension. So next slide, please. And we also suppose that the level of economic development very important, because economically developed countries are more likely to adopt decentralization policies than less developed ones. It's also research. In these studies, we use GDP per capita as a measure of the level of economic development of the region. Moreover, regional programs also use this indicator. Next slide, please. We also use the regionalist parties as a factor, and we use the notion of Massetti and Chakil. There is a limits of time, so I will limit just speaking about that. We use this notion, and we also use the metaphor provided by Hepburn, small world, to describe the territorial component of regionalist parties, because actually we have different problems with how to define the regionalist parties and how to include it in our paper. Next slide, please. Regional language also as a condition for identity. In this case, we use sociological polls, and the respondents were asked whether they consider the language of the autonomous community as a condition for the identification of citizens. So next slide, it's the results. Next slide, and one more slide is also the process of QCA. And next slide, yes, thank you so much. The results of the calibration and our process you can see on the screen. And firstly, the results show a causal link between the presence of regionalist parties, the level of economic development, and the high level of identity with language and centrifugal tendencies. Here it's the Catalonia and Basque countries, interesting case as the most economically developed regions, but in the case of Valencia, Canary Islands, what is more interesting in our research, the role of EU investments is additionally highlighted. Both autonomous communities are not economic leaders in Spain. GDP per capita is below the national median, while they receive quite a lot of assistance from the EU funds, which leads them to certain financial dependence on the European structural investment funds, and the presence of regionalist party only strengthens the authority's ability to manage money from the EU on its own. In this sense, regional policy stimulates attempts to directly interact with the EU, bypassing the central authorities. So it's the last point that I would like to mention. So next slide, please. I think I will stop here. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. It's a great pleasure to present the results of my work today.
Yeah, Julia, thank you so much. That was quite something in a very short period of time. Do we have a paper room? Whoever can download papers? Because otherwise it's probably pretty difficult to recall what you have just presented.
Yes, I will send it one more time, but I decided that it's important to mention somehow. Yeah. But I've sent it.
Yeah, because I was wondering whether the presence of regionalist parties in your CRISP QCA is a determinant or rather result of centrifugal tendencies, but these are details which at the next step might be discussed. And that is now the open floor for discussion. I'm begging on your activity now, please. Who has any comments, any questions, any remarks, anything? Who is it? Ranjbar? Ranjbar, is that the first name?
Yes, no, the first name is Daniel.
Daniel. Okay,
Daniel, yes.
Or Daniel.
Yeah.
What's that nationality?
I'm actually from Iran.
Iran. Great.
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, thank you for the all presentation and all the speakers. I just wondering, because we was working last days on the article about the digitalization process in Rome and Madrid as smart cities, future cities in Europe. So I have one question about that how do you think if Spain or if Europe is still going on in the sustainable development goals of United Nations, how is this integration was successful, especially in the crisis like COVID-19? And my next question is maybe more political because I'm international relations student. So I just wanted to ask how many you think the integration as a European Union after the Brexit that you mentioned in your introduction, after the Brexit, how many this European Union is still going on, if it is going to be bigger or if it's going to be smaller than before? Thank you.
Who wants to talk about being in or out, being efficient or not, being I don't know what? It was pretty hard to follow for you as well. There was some noise. So, anybody to answer that question? Fabienne?
Well, I don't think it was really addressed to me.
It was addressed to everybody, frankly.
Okay, but
it's
okay,
just my pick.
I don't think my insights on this would be very valuable, but I thought maybe it was more something for Natalia, because it was also about digitalization.
Well, that was a starting point, but it didn't end there. Okay, but Natalia, if you wish, you could follow. There was a translation into Russian.
Well, I can probably take the question about Brexit in the meantime while Natalia reflects on it.
I know you like Brexit.
No, I mean, like, there's nothing about like my personal sort of like preferences, I guess. But I think like what we have to consider is that there is no sort of like other country in the European Union that is ready to go to the extreme that Britain went. You know? And also what is important in the coming years, I guess, is how successful Britain will be outside of the European Union, sort of like with Brexit. Yeah, and that sort of like will to a large extent determine the sort of like preferences of other member states. But I mean, I don't expect, just like to address the question, to be I don't expect the European Union to be either bigger or smaller in the coming years. Not bigger because there is very little appetite to enlarge, and not smaller because I don't see any other candidate that is ready to go to the extreme that Britain went to. You know. So that's my sort of like contribution to the second question, and then basically back to you. And if somebody wants to address the first question, then yeah.
Fabienne wants. You raised your hand.
It's just that I can also address that question. Sorry. No, it's true. I didn't really hear the question very well, but now that Tatiana already addressed it, now I see what the question is. But I share Tatiana's view on this. Of course, I think in a way Brexit was quite exceptional, and I don't think what has happened, I don't think it has really sort of evened the path for other countries to follow the footsteps of Great Britain. I mean, we're still waiting to see, of course, the implications of this in the long term. But so far, it seems that the whole idea of also Brexit and Frexit and whatever is stopped to some extent. And I think there's let's wait and see how this further evolves. Of course, at the same time, we do see that populism is still on the rise across the whole of the EU, but also outside of the EU. It's not limited to the EU. And I think that, of course, will still also have an impact on whether potentially other EU member states will also want to leave the EU. But for now, it seems, I think it's more like let's wait and see how Brexit ultimately, what the applications are in the long term. But it's definitely not the best case if you see also the increasingly aggressive tone that you see between the EU and UK. I think this is also perhaps scaring other member states. But yeah, so just some insights on this question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, if we look a bit further back in time, there was this conflict or trade-off between enlargement and deepening. Yeah, the Brits, incidentally, were the ones who were pretty much in favor of enlargement because they didn't want deepening. Now the Brits are out. The question now is, are we heading for deepening instead? I mean, that somehow links these two parts of the question of our Iranian colleague. Are we in for deepening now? Or are we just flabbergasted by what's going on every day these days? I think as scholars, we should have a more wider-ranging look at the issues. Okay, Natalia, please. Just food for thought.
Пищу для ума мне подкинуло название выступления Фабиен. Название выступления Фабиен, где тоже содержалось вопрос о перспективах бюджета ЕС, расходов ЕС. Конечно, пищу для ума подкидывает доклад Татьяны Романовой о перспективах зеленой экономики. И, естественно, мы думаем о странах догоняющих. Последние расчеты Европейской комиссии, они говорят о том, что 30% фермеров в Европейском Союзе относятся к категории лиц старше 65 лет. Только 6% фермеров в Европейском Союзе – это лица моложе 35 лет. Если рассуждать глубже, то в Румынии, в Болгарии, в Греции, в Хорватии, на Кипре, на Мальте никакой сельскохозяйственной подготовки у фермеров нет. Вопрос состоит в том, как принуждать к прогрессу, как принуждать к цифровизации и к зеленой экономике таких фермеров. Это должна быть хорошая стратегия. Существует принцип политической обусловленности, финансовой обусловленности. В сельскохозяйственной политике есть принцип cross-compliance, да? Но вместе с тем все равно это вопрос открытый, на него пока нет ответа. Вопрос расходов, которые лягут на будущие поколения. Если посмотреть на бюджет, который принят в декабре 2020 года, если посмотреть широкий бюджет, который включает инвестиционные планы и стабилизационные механизмы, то в этом бюджете много кредитов. И там четко сказано, что эти кредиты будут оплачивать будущие поколения. Это риторический вопрос, да, Татьяны Романовой со своей концепцией устойчивости. Есть ли устойчивость? Ведь устойчивость – это когда нет вреда для будущего поколения. На сегодняшний день я не вижу ответа, я его не знаю. Возможно, в каких-то документах он содержится. Ответ на вопрос, кто платить будет. Так что вот.
All right. Any more questions, remarks? I have one here. Tatiana, once again. Michael. Michael first. He's a newcomer.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My question would go to Tatiana Romanova. I just wanted to thank you once again for presenting such an interesting topic. And I actually couldn't agree more with one of the hypotheses that, or one of the thoughts that you presented, a topic that despite all this kind of optimism that we're in this boat together with environment, I think pandemic also showed quite vividly, even though we are in this boat together, somehow this truce didn't take place and cooperation suddenly didn't go up. But I wonder if you thought about it, and I wonder if you could elaborate a bit. Taking into consideration that the EU Green Deal is indeed quite a complex kind of structure, if we think in a bigger terms, do you think that the global kind of environmental pact together with Russia is possible? You're probably aware of that. Professor Karaganov, actually, even though he's quite pessimistic about general cooperation with Europe, he still proposed that one of the ideas for a future role of Russia, that Russia could be this ecological superpower, and then that could potentially become one of the reasons how to bring Russia back kind of into the global fold. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. Thanks.
The Russian Green Deal. Hydropower, go ahead.
Well, in fact, Russia's environmental donorship is not new. Yeah, so there were debates on Russia's environmental donorship already at the beginning of this century. And the question is linked to two different issues. Yeah, I would say two. Yeah, one is that indeed, sort of like we most frequently calculate emissions with using 1990 as the base year. Yeah, and this is when all industries of the Soviet Union were still up and running, and then many of them sort of like collapsed or restructured, and therefore Russia emerged as sort of like as an actor that complies or over complies with CO2 reduction, not because it intended to do so, but because of the economic collapse that took place. So that's one thing. And the second thing is related to the sunk capacity of Russian forests, yeah? More specifically of the Russian Siberia, yeah? Because sort of like we maintain sort of like those forests, they sort of like, it's similar to the Amazon, yeah, being the lungs of the earth, yeah. So like the reasoning is exactly the same, yeah. But well, there are also sort of like counter arguments to this sunk capacity that we also have lots of swamps, for example, yeah. And then there is global warming, which leads to sort of like the warming of the Arctic, and as a result, methane releases is being released in the atmosphere. So the net result actually is not clear in terms of like whether the sunk capacity dominates or whether sort of like other emissions that we not calculate at present dominate. Yeah? But what is also important in this sort of like Russia's donorship and Russia being the environmental sort of like superpower, that it sort of like falls in a very rich soil of Russia sort of like trying to find itself in the world arena. Yeah. And my main worry about the report of Karaganov that you referred to is that it's more about international relations and Russia sort of like presenting the alternative to the West than about Russia being a true environmental leader. You know? And in a sense, sort of like, if you want a hierarchy, and I try to sort of like put that point in my presentation, as it stands now, sort of like what is dominated in Russia is the economic rationale, followed by the status rationale in the international arena, with environmental concerns coming third. Yeah? Whereas the priority for the European Union is different. The line of priorities, sort of like the hierarchy of priorities for the European Union is different, and sort of like there is a lot of sort of like talk nowadays in Moscow and throughout Russia about potential cooperation with the West. You know? Although sort of like Peskov recently said that sort of like there's no such thing as the West, is just like the part of the sort of like of coordinates and nothing else. Yeah, but anyways, yeah. So. So basically, there is a lot of aspiration about cooperating with the West. There's also a lot of talk at the technical level. Gazprom people have been doing that for quite a while. Yeah, there's now like the special representative of Russian president who is in contact with the European Commission on details and particularly on how to shield potential project from sanctions, from Western sanctions. Yeah? So there is a lot going on, but then at the same time, we don't have any sort of like clear roadmap. And that's, for example, in contrast with what the European Union has with Africa, yeah, for example, yeah, where there is a clear like roadmap of actions. Yeah, with us, it's more about sort of like talks, and there are too many sort of like conceptual talks as well, sort of like on not so much cooperation per se, but rather on positioning of Russia, yeah, and on using sort of like environmental debates as an issue of confrontation with the West. Yeah? And you said yourself, I totally agree with you, that the pandemic was not a disaster which was big enough, sort of like to bring Russia and the West together. And I think there's no urgency still in Russia in terms of climate change, and therefore I don't see how that can sort of like align Russia with the West in the short-term perspective. And then we will see how things will develop. But that's definitely, and just like Borrell, in fact, in his speech yesterday in the European Parliament, again referred to the Iran nuclear deal and to the climate change as two areas of selective engagement with Russia. So I think there is a good understanding on both sides that this is an area to engage, and at least there are some efforts to sort of like really convert it into the area of cooperation, even limited cooperation, selective cooperation.
Thanks a lot.
Yep, thank you. Natalia, еще раз. Или нет? Still the hand there. Okay. So, anybody else?
Can I just have a very short question to Fabian?
Yeah, since there are no other questions around, we can discuss among the panelists. Sure. Go ahead.
It's actually, I mean, it's not exactly in your field of study, but it's related. Yeah. Because when Borrell came to Moscow, like the delegation of the European Commission also published a report on the EU's assistance to Russia during the COVID pandemic. And that was sort of like, it was a nice sort of like reply, sort of like to like Russian discussion on what it did for like some EU member states. But have you come across sort of like that assistance, and have you probably reflected on it in terms of resilience and sort of like and that part of work? I know that it's obviously not Central Asia, but because you deal with this field, maybe you came across it and maybe you reflected on that, being sort of like also a specialist in EU-Russian relations.
But do you mean whether the EU is also trying to, in its resilience agenda, include Russia, and that it also would like to have,
what are the sort of like rationale about building resilience in that assistance, and whether it was framed in this way?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when we talk about resilience in the case of Russia, as you have already written, it's more in a negative sense that the EU has to increase its resilience against threats from Russia. But nevertheless, I think according to the same logic, the EU would also, sorry if you're hearing noises, it's my it's my agenda popping up. No, I mean, along the same logic, of course, the EU would also be interested in strengthening societal resilience in Russia. But yeah, I think, of course, it's going to, in order to be able to do that, the EU would have to have a new strategy for Russia. And it doesn't have that, because at the moment it's just about these 5 principles, and they are to some extent tied to the EU's global strategy from 2016, but at the same time, they themselves, they're not a strategy. For instance, for Central Asia, the EU has a new strategy, which nicely ties into the EU global strategy, but also the connectivity strategy, also the development policy of the EU. So this strategy for Central Asia is fully updated, and it has this ability to also engage with the whole resilience agenda of the EU. But for Russia, yeah, the only thing now is indeed more about strengthening the EU's resilience against threats from Russia, rather than promoting actively also the resilience of Russia's society. That said, let's say indirectly, the EU is trying to do that, but still, of course, also engaging with civil society. But because of the current appalling state of affairs in terms of EU-Russia relations, not much is happening there as well. So yeah, but I think this could only happen really if the EU would come with a new strategy, a real strategy, let's say, because the 5 principles are not a strategy for its relations with Russia. No.
There won't be a EU strategy with regard to Russia.
Not
that's my take. Not even anytime soon, not at all, I'm afraid. But that is not only the fault of the European Union, I would say. Russia is not giving any kind, even a semblance of helping hand to arrive at something coherent on the part of the European Union. Rather the opposite. All right, so we have come to an end, I'm afraid. If nobody else is left who really wants to get in, we should conclude our meeting now. Thank you very much to everybody. I think it was quite interesting, inspiring and stimulating. I hope for everybody on the panel as well. And we'll most probably see you on another occasion, hopefully in person again. I mean, these online exercises are really a mess, to be frank. In particular, when they go on and on and on. I'm wishing you all the best. Keep safe, particularly those in Russia. I've just read a new article that the numbers are also rising again in Russia. So the third wave is not going around your huge country, although everything is past lockdown mood, so to speak. We are not past the pandemic, unfortunately, I'm afraid, everywhere. So keep safe, stay healthy, and all best till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.